Of course, I'm really happy to be here to convince you, to share with you my impressions and experiences, and that I'm lucky to have had with Stephane, and to also say something scientific, if possible, about how Stephane's auditory system contributions are enormous, and as I said in my abstract. But I'll explain to you this slide later, and there's a picture I took of Stephane, and of course I know a lot of you are image processing gurus and think this is Photoshop, and I just wanted to convince you it's not, because this is from a different angle. And is everything okay? Yeah. Okay, good. Now I can relax and enjoy this. The way the story begins with Stephane is that really we had no reason for a chance to meet. He's a mathematician. He lived in France and did image processing, whereas I came from EE and lived in USA and auditory physiology and speech and so on. So the areas of intersection are rather small. But as the French scientist Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind, and I certainly had a prepared mind ready for Stephane to come by chance in front of me. And we hooked up, and what I want to share with you is the evolution of this relationship and how enormously exciting and impressive it was. And so it began in the mid-'80s. A lot of you were not even born by then. We were in the auditory world working on recording from cat's auditory nerve, recording of hundreds of nerve fibers coming out of the cochlea there on the left-hand side. And we studied forever every detail of these kinds of pictures, trying to figure out what does the cochlea want to do. Some people, of course, said Fourier transforms, and other people said no, delay lines and this and that. And every detail in this picture was a PhD and sometimes a whole career. But the overall story was basically, in the mid-'80s, was trying to come up with a mathematical description that can capture all of these things and make sense of it. Why on earth does it exist? And so you have all these banks of filters on the left-hand side, and then in each channel you have a transform. ReLU, of course, showed up, and low pass and high pass, and so on and so forth, all to generate some kind of a spectrogram that we thought existed. And all of a sudden, while we're in the middle of this, wavelets burst on the scene. And lo and behold, it was, oh my God, the cochlea is simply doing a wavelet transform. Basically, it all made sense. That you can now capture the function of the cochlea. The very first stage, the mechanical, not even neural yet, is captured with this sort of beautiful, elegant analysis with the wavelets, with the wavelet transform. And so we began to look into the details of what's happening in those pictures I showed you, and looking at what are they really wavelet representations? Do they qualify as such? And one of the, for example, things we looked at, and you'll see in a minute why this is relevant, is looking at the outputs of the cochlea on a given nerve, which are remarkably different than anything else you have in the body. Maybe except the knee. Let me explain why. When an output of a wavelet transform at a given channel comes out, everywhere else it says take the energy and ignore everything else. especially in the nervous system, because we're talking about frequencies on the orders of kilohertz. And some animals, like the barn owl, you're talking about 10,000 hertz, 10 kilohertz. So, but what the auditory nerve did is rather unusual. It preserved the actual waveforms coming out of the cochlea. And it preserved them, so you have a signal that is 3-4 kilohertz. Somehow the nerve has to carry that in its phase and its detail. And to sample such a thing and preserve the information, you need rates that just don't exist in the body. And brilliantly, the auditory nerve devised a Poisson point process and treated the output of the wavelet as the intensity function, and you have multiple nerves going, and they're precisely sampling, but very randomly and sparsely. This signal, and then reconstructs it back in the next stage. And so you have pictures like that, which now really do look like a wavelet transform for a given tone coming through the cochlea with all of the phase and all of the intensity, and you have these sort of nice details and all that. You have a frequency axis along the length of the cochlea, and then if you put two tones, you have this nice separation between them, peaks that clearly tell you where everything is. Everything looked really elegant and simple until you discover that the auditory nerve has an incredibly limited dynamic range, 20-30 dBs, whereas your hearing has 100+ dBs. So when you increase the intensity just a little bit, everything on those channels become basically a square wave. And so, and spreads everywhere. And so how on earth are you going to preserve information like just to peaks of two tones? And that's where you have things like, for example, what your eye is doing. You look at because of the phase characteristics of the outputs, you see these edges that capture the locations of where the tones are and so on. So that immediately led us to think about edges. And because they're square waves, you're really talking about transitions or zero crossings and extrema and so on and so forth. And so we looked into these, and of course the very first question that comes up is how on earth are you going to recover the information centrally with a reasonable hardware called nerves? And you know, when you have something like speech, you have incredibly complicated patterns of square waves now, zero crossings basically, and somehow you have to reconstruct these kinds of spectrograms out of them. And so that was really a major concern at the time. Of course, it was remarkable because the first thing we noticed was Stephane was working on zero crossings of wavelet transforms too. That was fantastic. So now also a lot of that kind of machinery for capturing the details of these happenings in the auditory nerve, and also the reconstructions from the spectrograms back all the way to the details of the acoustic signal. And I won't bother you with the reconstructions, but you can, from trivial pictures like that, reconstruct precisely the original sound almost without distinction, and from the zero crossings and all that. And even in the brain of a ferret, which is what a lot of my work has been, you can take all the nerve firings and all of that and reconstruct from the responses in the brain. You can reconstruct back the audio and all of that. So it was really nice. It was this machinery, this mathematics that is out there. It makes you feel like you have a friend out there who is supplying the answers as you think about them. Of course, the reason we thought about all these things was because we were forced to. That's what the auditory nerve had. And so we're asking the first question, then the next, then the next, and the next. And as you'll see, but I don't know how Stephane thought about all these things. Maybe he'll tell us sometime. But it was always just a step ahead so that you can have the machinery available. And in 1992, lo and behold, there was this issue of transactions of information theory, which it's the only issue I ever had of transactions of information theory. It's 30 years old now. It was sitting in a corner in my office last week that I have not visited since computers were invented and you start reading on computers and you don't look at paper anymore. And I went on these massive shelves looking around, and sure enough, this thing came up right away. And so I decided to bring it because Stephane was the editor of that issue, and we had two papers here, Stephane, and these are the papers. And this is a listing of the papers in the journal, and sure enough, it was amazing affinity. Yeah. I know. That's the reason I blew up that. I mean, the first two names were us, and then the other names were right down there. Yeah, a lot of the people in this audience. So if you're nostalgic, I'm happy to have you look at the issue, but you're not allowed to take it. I have
my own copy.
You have your own copy?
We all have the same copy.
The same one copy. Well, I don't read information theory, but somehow it survived. Okay. In 91, I went on a sabbatical to Berkeley, and I remember at the time, and I'll explain to you in a second why that is. I met Russ in America, they call him Divaloy, and Russ was sitting in a cafe with me. I've never met him before, and he said, let me tell you something, and I was listening to try to understand how the visual cortex works, because we got now into the auditory cortex, and he said, Shihab, the auditory cortex is probably like the visual cortex. The visual cortex is basically a Fourier transform. What do you mean, the Fourier transform? I mean, this is a visual cortex, miles away up in the central nervous system, and we're talking about cochlea. He said, it's just like the cochlea. So I tried to not ignore him. He's a really smart guy. He gave me his book, and I read it, and immediately started doing experiments trying to understand really what's going on. What does he mean, and does it really add up? And while I was there was a meeting at a campus just next to Berkeley. Clark Kirk is part of the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. And this gentleman was there, and Stephane, I introduced myself. That was the first time we met. We were teenagers, kind of. And I remember sitting on the steps, literally, that's the entrance of the Clark Kirk campus. And we sat on the steps, and I said, Stephane, is it possible that you can take a wavelet transform of another wavelet transform? Yeah, you can take as many as you want. Okay. And so I went back home. And you look in the auditory system, and you're in the cochlea, and there's the cortex, which is where we were working, and there are a lot of wavelet transforms possible along the way. And we know the first one is here, and we're working up here. So we thought, okay, if there are, what evidence is there for these kinds of transformations going from stage to stage? This is really different, obviously, from the visual system, where the very first synapse you go is going to be at the LGN. And that's like the fourth synapse by the time in the auditory system on the shortest path. So and when you look in the auditory system at the auditory nerve, I told you just now, there's phase preserved and timings up to kilohertz, 10 kilohertz in some animals. And but when you go to the midbrain, halfway up to the cortex, you drop by an order of magnitude. The fastest you go is hundreds of hertz. And you go up to the cortex, it drops another order of magnitude. So in the maximum 10, 20 hertz. So that sort of smells like a possible transformations and all that. So we started looking into it in this. We generated sounds that are called ripples, which are basically like sinusoids in time. And in frequency, the auditory system has one spatial axis, at least conceptually, as opposed to the visual with two. And so these are like drifting gratings, but one-dimensional drifting gratings. And then we record the neurons in the auditory cortex, and sure enough, they lock and they preserve the phase beautifully. This was sort of in the early 90s, and then you do it again, but this time you change the rates in time, or you change the spatial frequency, and you get these beautiful responses, and you can then estimate the response to each quote-unquote ripple, and you generate a two-dimensional sort of set of coefficients, or wavelet, sort of a Fourier spectrum, if you will, and then inverse transform it, and you get your receptive field. And when we did that, it was really quite exciting, because all of a sudden you see these receptive fields that made no sense, some of them broad, some of them turned sideways, some of them, we have thousands of these by now, and we try scratching our heads trying to figure out why on earth would there be so many and what for. And so that's the basic idea. Was, again, it's the wavelet transform is that if you have another if you have the image of the early auditory system and you have a wavelet transform, to do that takes you from 2 dimensions into 4 dimensions. And so you have this sort of wavelet transform, which we call the cortical representation, unimaginative names, as I will explain. Yeah, and so it did have the structure of a wavelet transform, but you know, people in the auditory system cannot escape this all the time. We have Fourier transforms of Fourier transforms. They call them Kepstra because they ran out of names, and they call them, instead of frequencies, quiffrencies, and so it's just completely crazy, but you're forced to do that. It's not like it's in your face. And so it's, the ideas don't necessarily come from inside, they come from outside into. But there it is. Things progressed in the 90s, and then I came on a sabbatical, this time to Paris. And 20 years later, I'm here at ONS, and I see this announcement that Stephane Mallat is going to give a talk. Oh, I didn't know where he was. Thought he was at NYU and all of that. So I went to the talk, and we started chatting and talking, and this time we're a little bit older, and but it did feel exactly the same as that moment we met 20 years earlier. And we talked some more, and I tried to understand where he is in the world now, what happened. I discovered so many surprises that I had not imagined. We discovered within 5 minutes that our kids are the same age, exactly the same grade in school. In fact, they go to the same school in Paris, and they both play violin, and our spouses were both professional pianists. I said, this is weird.
Same wife.
And I guess you know Stephane. There he is. And these are the different people that I just mentioned. And I said, what do you... So, you know, the talk was also a shock, because it was beautiful. It was, again, the mathematical machinery for all that cortical transformation, but it was called the scattering transform. And it was so nice to see all the mathematical machinery and descriptions that are really capturing all these transformations and all that. So Stephane and I, basically now we had a lot to share and to talk about. And there was just not enough time in the day to do that. So we decided to meet every Saturday to go for a run. So we go for 2 or 3 hours, mostly talking, but also running. And whether it's rain or shine, hot or cold. And we talked about everything, but mostly science. And it was really very easy to run 3 hours with Stephane, because he had something interesting but in doubt about every week. And so he asked my opinion, and I supplied the opinion. And of course, I have to be extremely, I have to be critical because he doesn't appreciate you agreeing with them right away. But at the same time, you have to be a believer. So, like every prophet had a believer who gave them the confidence to continue. Aaron to Moses, St. Paul to Jesus, Abu Bakr for Prophet Muhammad. I was his basically believer, but a critic, a little bit of a critic that kept us going for 3 hours. And I don't know if you, I guess you know, Stephane would not, he could not change the cortical transform to some new interesting name because it was too late. But as you know about Let It Wave and matching pursuits, and I'll tell you a bit more about some of the other things. And we ran every place we found ourselves together. In Paris, New York, Washington, Normandy, and in India. I invited Stephane to give a few lectures there, and he was such a kind teacher. He spent more time after the lecture talking to the students who would not let go, because he was super popular with them, but he was also equally popular with the faculty. And faculty were so beaming when they had Stephane there. As you see the slide, this says, "There's hope for signal processing, finally." Thank you, Stephane. And welcome to DSP, Deep Signal Processing. So he was, again, so very popular with the faculty and even with monkeys. Who, during the coffee breaks, I don't think the monkeys will walk in here, but we had this experience with them coming in, and even with the spiritual side of life, where Stephane was thinking of the next idea, but this time, over the years, over the last few years, we had a lot more interactions, and Stephane now is more overtly interested in the auditory system per se, and he had students working on classifications of variety of textures and vision, and that inspired, of course, on the other side, speech and what we call timbre. It's the same idea as textures, basically. And his students working on music and audio and me. So we had a lot to talk about this time, overtly and covertly. And we finally even converged, and we published together a couple of papers in auditory. But of course, you couldn't resist the temptation of adding the visual part to it. And so the title was more vision, but actually the content was more auditory. And we nowadays talking about pitch, random projections, and all that. So I just want to share with you one example, very quick, of an experience that happened over the last 2 or 3 years, where I became interested in sensory motor interactions in the brain. Auditory system has a lot of sensory motor interactions, because as I'm speaking to you now, I'm listening to myself, and this interactions between my motor system and my auditory system is intimate and very important. And of course, when you dance in music and so on and so forth. And so we record it from people while they're speaking, while they're listening, and while they're miming, just moving their mouth without producing sound. And we got pictures like that, which we, quote unquote, called auditory motor interactions in speaking, where you have these sort of auditory cortex feeding into the motor areas feeding back into the auditory cortex, and so on. Well, so we started talking, Stephane and I, and pretty soon this nice network that is quite neural unfolded. and became an autoencoder. And sure enough it is. I mean, there's the auditory cortex feeding into the motor, and the motor feeding back into the auditory cortex through two pathways, and so on. That really opens up a whole range of new ideas. Interesting things to discuss. Well, so on a run in Central Park with Stephane, I'm telling him the latest thing about this auditory motor interaction is now I have to call it autoencoder. And the network became, he said, Shihab, you can't call it auditory motor interaction. You have to give it a decent name. So he called it the mirror network. So we started, and now I only refer to it as the mirror network because it's mirroring the auditory cortex from one side and the other, and so on. And all these neural interactions basically mirror and give each recipient what the other one is trying to do. And on another run, the network morphed into a convolutional neural network, and in detail. And so when time came to publish this paper, I really wanted Stephane to be a co-author in this, and he, of course, refused. And so I convinced the journal to allow me to put a whole note dedicated to Stephane, to thank him for the contribution. But this is the example of how Stephane influences and inspires. He's inspiring people around him all the time with new ideas, with challenges, with this and that. Even one last inspiration I share with you with confidence. So my wife, who does not trust me at all when it comes to anything physical, we went skiing with Stephane, and we went off-piste, and we went up to some ridge, and then we descended on the other side, and oh my God, Shihab, what have you done? And of course, I was about to get killed when Stephane intervened and took my wife aside and led her down the side and trying to coach her. And of course, she had immediate confidence and calm. And Stephane gave her detailed instructions on what to do and how to basically now fall that way, but thanking him while she's doing that. And they did that, they turned, and you can see the beginning of the turn, and then Stephane basically saved the day. And they went down the mountain. And so there's an example of inspiring confidence. If he can do this for my wife, he can do anything. So let me finish now with the original slide I began with, which is really to say, what on earth does make Stephane tick? And when I took this photograph, I immediately thought of the Irish legend of the leprechauns. And I think most of you know that when an Irish person meets a leprechaun, there's the leprechaun over there. The leprechaun has to grant this person their wish in order to be freed, to be let go. And when I see rainbows, I cannot help but think of leprechauns and think of wishes, making wishes. And when I was with Stephane and we saw the rainbows, I thought, what could possibly Stephane wish for? And because I didn't bother to ask, I just was making my own thoughts. And I went through my mind, maybe a pot of gold, this is what the Irish legend says, and no. And I immediately dismissed that because I never heard Stephane has enough and he really doesn't want to waste a wish on a pot of gold. So I thought maybe some kids, I mean, he told me once that he dreamt when he was really young that he would have 10 children and all of that. But you know what? He's got a beautiful, bubbly daughter, a lot of fun, and Milena, I'm sure, is enough for him. and he would not ask for another. So I thought maybe his partner, Lydie, again, she's amazing because she was willing to talk to me in French for a whole hour or two. And I don't know if you know, but this is a feat. It's not trivial to put up with me speaking French for an hour. So that's not, he's got Lydie. Family and friends, he has enormous number of really close family and friends in Paris where he grew up and spent all his school and everything. So he's got a lot of those. And maybe going more skiing, traveling and all that. He's doing a lot of that anyway, and he doesn't need the leprechaun to give it to him. And I thought, I know it. He always told me he wanted peace and quiet to do math. It's really hard to come by these days. And he really wanted to prove basically as many theorems as possible before GPT-10 takes over. And then proves everything and there's nothing left for him to do. And I think he knows that deep inside last time I talked to him. And so this kind of wish is a waste of time because there will be nothing to prove soon enough. So what is it that Stephane could possibly wish? And I think I now really understand. Stephane truly craves having the search for a wish, the journey to get a wish. Stephane enjoys the experience of it. And we are all basically, I am speaking for myself, we are lucky to come across basically a little boy excited about all of these things and has some interesting new ideas every week, every Saturday, and makes life just so much more uncertain and exciting. And so I want to thank you, Stephane, for this amazing 10, and hopefully we'll have 60 more years of you. At least we share part of it with you. So thank you very much.
Let me just say that Shihab is a totally amazing runner, running 160 miles.
You catch up very well.
Following him for whatever, 5-10 kilometers, you have to make him speak, which is why I tried that strategy to survive.
Thank you for speaking.
Let me ask a question. You were saying about these neural networks and so on.
Yeah.
So what is afterwards? It's deep nets inside. What is for you the view of where
the mirror
it's
network
going for auditory networks, for the auditory system?
Well, there are two paths. One is the neural, and that's really tough because we don't have many volunteers that would be willing to have electrodes go in their heads, and at least, and so we have to do it with animals, and animals don't easily lend themselves as good models for auditory motor stuff, except for birds perhaps. So anyway, we are trying to do this with the neural pathways and trying to understand where these things are happening and all of that. But on the conceptual side and the modeling side, that's an open question. That's really, there's so much more that one can do. But as you can see from this, it always feels like there is a turn in the road somewhere along the way. So no matter what I plan, the next run takes you somewhere you don't know. So next time we run, I'll tell you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.